Viva Evans lived in a simple house on a quiet street in a small town. The house, with its brick walls worn by time, was spacious enough for her and her husband Jonas to have lived there for many years. But now, without him, the house seemed much larger and emptier than it had ever been. She looked at the furniture that had once been shared by both of them, now only occupied by her. Jonas's favorite armchair, its fabric a little faded, sat there in silence, waiting for company that would never come again. Viva was 63 years old, and she felt every one of those years deep in her heart. She had always been a strong woman, but Jonas's death had been such a blow that it seemed time no longer rushed to pass. There were days when she wondered if the world was still spinning around her, or if she was simply stuck in an endless cycle of longing and memories. The friends who had once surrounded her now seemed distant, and even Viva's own family, busy with their lives, made little effort to stay in touch. She didn't blame anyone, but the loneliness was becoming unbearable. Every morning upon waking, she felt an immense emptiness. The breakfast she used to share with Jonas was now a solitary meal. The house felt bigger, colder, and quieter than ever before. She spent her days sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the window, watching the world go by outside, but feeling as if she were on the sidelines of everything. Sometimes she missed a simple conversation, someone to share the small moments of the day, like a cup of tea or the smell of freshly baked bread. But Viva's life wasn't just sadness. She still had strength. She had always been known for her dedication and courage in the face of adversity. When Jonas was alive, she had lovingly cared for him, and now alone, she didn't quite know how to care for herself. She tried to involve herself in activities to fill the void, reading books, crocheting, and even attempting to grow some plants in the small garden. But nothing seemed to bring the same joy she felt when she was with Jonas. One afternoon, while tending to the flowers in her garden, Viva thought about how fleeting life seemed. The plants grew and bloomed so naturally, but she felt stagnant, as if the sadness had paralyzed her. She remembered the days when she and Jonas laughed together, planting those same flowers, making plans for a future that now no longer existed. The weight of loneliness felt harder and harder to carry, and somehow she felt she needed something more, perhaps even someone to help her find meaning in the days that passed without much change. Then a thought came to her mind, something she had never considered before. She couldn't keep living like this, locked in her pain, without trying to change something. Time wasn't waiting for her, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to take a new step. To seek something or someone to break the silence of her life. The pain of loss was immense, but she didn't want loneliness to define her forever. She thought of her children who were far away and how she could reconnect with them, or how she could find a new way to make her life more meaningful. Could this be a new beginning? Viva didn't know, but she felt that something had to change. She no longer wanted to live only with the memories of a past that, even though so dear, was imprisoning her. Each day, Viva took a small step toward facing her loneliness. It wasn't easy, and sometimes she felt weak, but there was a spark of hope that still shone within her. Maybe life still had something to offer, even for someone who had already lived so much. Now, certain that she needed to move forward, Viva began looking for new ways to connect with the world, and who knows, maybe this journey would lead her to new encounters, new friendships, or even a reunion with her family. She knew that life wouldn't be the same, but she also knew she could find a new path, one that would no longer be marked by the pain of loss, but by the hope that there's always something more ahead, waiting to be discovered. And so, day by day, Viva began rebuilding herself. She realized that loneliness didn't have to be a prison, and that despite the difficulties, there was always room for new beginnings. The emptiness she felt no longer controlled her, and with each small act of courage, she reclaimed her own happiness. The future, though uncertain, didn't seem so frightening after all. Viva Evans never imagined that her days of solitude would be interrupted by two young boys full of energy and curiosity. She was used to the tranquility of her home, the soft sound of the breeze in the trees, and the silence that filled every corner. But everything changed when her 17-year-old twin grandsons, Caden and Kieran, arrived to spend 2 weeks with her. Alicia, Viva's daughter, and her husband Devon were on a diplomatic mission, and as usual, they needed to leave the boys with their grandmother. They had done this a few times before, but now, with the twins a little older, the sense that things would be different seemed stronger. Even so, Viva was ready to welcome her grandsons with an open heart. After all, she knew that the time with them would be precious. The moment Caden and Kieran arrived, Viva felt a mixture of emotions. The sound of their laughter and quick conversations filled the house in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. The twins were excited, as if the very idea of spending 2 weeks with their grandmother was a grand adventure. Their faces shone with excitement, and their eyes were always alert, searching for something new to explore. Viva watched them with affection and curiosity. She remembered when the boys were very small, when they would visit and run around the garden, drawing in the dirt and playing hide and seek. Now, as teenagers, things felt different, but their essence was still there. Caden was outgoing, full of ideas, with an easy smile, while Kieran, quieter, preferred to observe and think before speaking. But he had an intelligence that fascinated Viva. In the first few days, Viva's house felt livelier than ever. She prepared meals, and the twins, with their discerning tastes, insisted on helping, or rather, suggesting how the food could be improved. During breakfast, conversations about the day ahead were brief, with Kieran asking about Viva's plans for the garden, and Caden suggesting activities they could do together, like a hike in the nearby forest, or even a trip to the town library, something he loved. Viva didn't know how to react to the sudden change in her routine. She was no longer alone, and as happy as she was for the company, something inside her felt a mix of apprehension and nostalgia. The boys' excited smiles, their jokes and stories made her recall the time when her own home was filled with life and love. But something deeper was happening inside Viva. She was rediscovering a part of herself that had been lost over time, the ability to connect, to care, and above all, to teach. There was something special about the way the twins, Caden and Kieran, looked at her. Even with the energy of teenagers, there was a genuine curiosity in their eyes, as if they were seeking to understand more about the world and the people who inhabited it. Kieran, with his philosophical questions about life and the meaning of things, touched something deep inside of Viva, while Caden, with his creative ideas and vibrant energy, made her laugh in a way she hadn't in a long time. Each night, when the sun began to set and the house filled with a cozy silence, the three of them gathered in the living room. Caden and Kieran snuggled up on the couch with their feet stretched out, while Viva sat in her favorite armchair. Conversations about the day, stories from the past, jokes, and even some reflections on life flowed through their words. Something that once seemed distant and intangible to Viva, the idea of passing on wisdom, of connecting generations, was now happening naturally, almost magically. As the days passed, Viva began to realize that her life, which once seemed marked by loneliness, was transforming into something more meaningful. The company of the twins brought back the joy she thought she had lost. They, in some way, were helping heal the wounds time had left, and she, in turn, was helping shape their future with stories of family, life, and love. At the end of the second week, when Alicia and Devon returned to pick up the boys, Viva felt a mix of emotions. She was happy to see them, of course, but at the same time, there was a pang of sadness. The twins had become an essential part of her days. And even though it was temporary, the time spent with them had been precious and transformative. Caden and Kieran hugged her before they left, and their words stayed etched in Viva's memory. Caden, with that wide smile, said, "Grandma, don't be sad. We'll be back soon, and then you'll see. We'll do more things together." Kieran, more serious but with his eyes shining, added, "I really liked hearing your stories, Grandma. You have so much wisdom. I want to learn more from you." In that moment, Viva realized that life, despite its ups and downs, was always ready to surprise her. The love and company of her grandsons had renewed her spirit in a way she had never imagined. She knew that, even with the longing, the house would still echo with the energy of the twins for a long time. And as they walked away, Viva smiled, knowing that no matter how much loneliness still existed in certain moments, she would never be the same. The grandchildren had left an indelible mark on her heart, and now she knew the doors of life were always open, ready for new encounters, new stories, and new beginnings. Time passed, and gradually, Viva Evans' grandchildren, Caden and Kieran, transformed into young adults. Those boys full of energy and curiosity, who had come to her home as teenagers eager for fun and discoveries, now seemed a little different. There was something new in the air. Their confidence, which had once been only a flash of youth, was now visible in every gesture, in every word. They were ready to conquer the world, to take the reins of their own lives, and this began to unsettle Viva in ways she couldn't understand. The change happened gradually, without her quite realizing the moment when everything started to shift. At first, it was a small discomfort here and there, a louder laugh, an irreverent comment, a look that said, "We know everything." But as the weeks passed, this discomfort grew. When the twins entered the house, the first thing Viva noticed was how they behaved, as if they no longer needed her in the same way. Before, they had been kind and considerate, always asking for her opinion on what to do or how to act. But now, it seemed they were so immersed in their own worlds that they hardly stopped to look at her. Caden, with his confident smile and eyes always full of bold ideas, no longer seemed like the mischievous boy he once was. He was starting to get involved with new groups of friends, people from different places, with opinions and ideals that seemed challenging to Viva. He spoke about politics, career, and travel as if the world were his, and he already had the answers to all the questions. He made her feel out of sync with what was happening around her. "Grandma, you have no idea what's going on. The world is changing fast, and we have to keep up or we'll fall behind," he'd say, with that tone of someone who already knew exactly what to do. Kieran, the more introspective twin, was now much more talkative and outgoing than before. His presence was always accompanied by vibrant energy and confidence. He, too, was immersed in the world of his own ambitions, as if he had already decided to follow his own path without needing anyone's approval. He talked about his accomplishments, how he was starting to build a network of contacts, and even about the uncertain yet promising future he had in mind. Every time he spoke about the future, Viva felt a pang of discomfort. It was as though, with all her life experience, she was watching from a distance something she no longer understood. The conversations that had once been filled with laughter and childhood stories now seemed tense, full of a kind of distance that Viva couldn't fully comprehend. There was an invisible line that seemed to have been drawn between her and the twins, a line she didn't know how to cross. Sometimes, as they talked about trips, study plans, or their careers, she felt like a stranger in her own home. Their desire to distance themselves, to show the world they were capable of paving their own way, seemed like a silent challenge to her. Viva knew that time had changed everyone, and she couldn't expect things to be like before. But it wasn't easy to accept. She still remembered when the twins were little, when she was there to guide them, teaching them how to ride bikes, take care of the garden, bake cakes and bread. And now, it seemed they were drifting away from her with a natural desire for freedom. It wasn't rejection, she knew that. But for Viva, it was a quiet pain, as though the roots she had tried to plant in their lives were being slowly pulled out, and there was nothing she could do. At night, when the house became quieter, Viva would sit in her favorite armchair, looking out the window, trying to understand where she fit into this new scenario. She felt like an observer, someone who had already played her role, but didn't know how to continue participating in their lives. Caden and Kieran, with their conversations and dreams, seemed to be in another world now, a world she, in some way, was no longer part of. "Grandma, you need to start understanding how the world works today. Things have changed a lot," Caden had said once, with that tone of someone already giving a lesson. "Life is about reinventing yourself, being brave, going after your goals." And although he was right about many things, those words made Viva's heart tighten. She wondered if there was still space for her in her grandchildren's world, or if her cycle had already come to an end there. Kieran, on the other hand, also showed a certain restlessness. He talked about the pressure to be successful, about the need to make the right choices to not get lost along the way. For him, the pressure was everywhere, in career choices, personal image, and societal expectations. But sometimes, when he looked at Viva with that calm gaze, as if he could still find some comfort in her, she felt that in some way he still needed her, even if in a different way. Viva knew that life was taking her grandchildren down a path where she no longer had much control. And although it was natural, it was still hard to swallow. The discomfort she felt didn't come from a lack of love, but from a sense of being left behind. She would sometimes wonder what it would be like if things were different, if she could keep up with their pace, if she could understand their new ways of seeing the world, if she still had something important to offer. However, the discomfort didn't make her give up. She knew that her love for her grandchildren would never go away. And somehow, she believed that this discomfort was just a phase, a transition that everyone would go through. Like so many other phases of life, she didn't know how she would deal with it. But one thing she was sure of: time, with all its complexity and change, always teaches us to move forward, even when the journey becomes harder than we expected. Viva Evans, a woman who had always prided herself on being firm in her convictions and principles, was feeling more and more uncomfortable in the presence of her grandchildren, Caden and Kieran. She had been a woman with a generous heart, but she also knew how to set boundaries. After losing her husband, Jonas, and being alone for so long, she had created a space where she felt in control, where things were done her way and according to her worldview. But something was changing, and she didn't know how to handle it. Caden and Kieran, at 17, were growing at an accelerated pace, turning into young adults with their own desires, opinions, and especially a natural magnetism. There was something in their eyes, a spark of confidence and freedom, that seemed to attract not only the people around them, but also Viva, in a way she had never imagined. She had always seen them as children, but now, as time passed, she began to realize how they were becoming more than that. They were young people with charm, with a power of attraction that seemed unexpected. Viva felt a disconcerting sensation when she looked at them. She tried to convince herself that they were just grandchildren, and her relationship with them had always been one of care and affection. But something in their gestures and words started to awaken feelings in her that she didn't want to acknowledge. Kieran, with his calm smile and deep gaze, seemed to look at her in a different way, as if he knew something she wasn't willing to see. Meanwhile, Caden, with his outgoing and bold personality, drew her attention in a way that made her feel uneasy. There were moments when she would see them talking, laughing together, and she felt a sudden urge to join them, to be part of that youthful energy and vitality. But when she did, a feeling of guilt would wash over her. How could she be thinking these things? How could she feel attracted to these boys, her own grandchildren? They were still so young, and despite all the conflicting emotions, she knew deep down that the only way to deal with it was to ignore these impulses and keep the boundaries firm, as she had always done. But with each passing day, it was becoming harder. Caden, in particular, was starting to stand out. His defiant attitude, his vibrant energy, his piercing gaze that seemed to capture everything around him. He had this way of moving, of speaking, that, unintentionally, made Viva look at him differently. Not in a romantic way, of course, but with an admiration that made her question her own sanity. He seemed so authentic, so ahead of his time, and no matter how hard she tried to avoid it, she couldn't help but feel drawn to his presence. And worse still was Kieran, who, with his calmness and intelligence, began to appear in her thoughts in an inexplicable way. Sometimes she would catch herself silently watching him as he read or was immersed in his own thoughts. He had an ability to focus so deeply on things that made her think that somewhere deep inside, he knew exactly what was going on, as if he was aware of the confusion she was feeling, but never spoke about it. He never said a word, but the furtive glances they exchanged, even if brief, left her with a lump in her throat. Viva tried to be rational, tried to convince herself that there was nothing wrong. After all, they were her grandchildren, the children of her daughter Alicia and her son-in-law Devon. They had been raised by her and Jonas with so much love, and now she was being overcome by these feelings that made no sense at all. She knew this couldn't happen. This wasn't right. She had always been proud of being a woman of solid principles, who maintained her integrity. But how could she explain the whirlwind in her heart? Every time she felt this attraction, guilt would follow immediately. It was as if something was wrong with her, as if she had lost control of the situation. She was no longer young. She was 60, and she knew she needed to be the pillar of strength for her family. How could she be seen with these feelings, these conflicting emotions? How could she still be respected if something inside her was so broken? At night, after the twins were in their room, she would sit in the armchair, watching the silent house. She felt alone, as always, but now with a different kind of loneliness, a loneliness that came from a deeper place. She wondered if her grandchildren knew what was going on inside her, if they could sense the internal struggle she was fighting. But of course, she couldn't talk about it. She couldn't. It would be an unthinkable shame. Sometimes, while looking out the window, thinking about everything that was happening, she wondered what Jonas would say if he were there. If he was still alive, maybe things would be different. He had always been the one who guided her, the man with whom she had shared her whole life. But now, she was alone, with a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that disoriented her. Viva tried to deny it, tried to suppress these feelings that confused her. But the more she tried to push them away, the more they seemed to rise to the surface, like an unpredictable tide, breaking through the barriers she tried to build. She didn't know what to do with it. The rules she had set for her life were breaking right before her eyes, and she felt powerless to stop it. She didn't want to give in to this dilemma, but deep down she knew that something was changing within her. And perhaps it was necessary to face these emotions, these confusions, in order to move forward in a more honest way with herself. But how could she do that without losing everything she had built? As the weeks went by, Viva began to notice something that made her feel even more uncomfortable and at the same time confused. Her grandchildren, Caden and Kieran, were starting to behave differently toward her. The sense of vulnerability that she had been trying to hide was becoming increasingly obvious to them, and unknowingly, the twins began to exploit this weakness. In a subtle, almost imperceptible way, they crossed boundaries that she never imagined would be crossed. Caden, always the more extroverted and charismatic of the two, was the first to realize that his grandmother, once so firm, was becoming a more fragile, more malleable figure. With his irreverent smile and surplus of confidence, he began testing her limits. At first, it was something simple, like asking for permission to stay out later or making demands about what he wanted for dinner. These little requests, which would have been easily denied before, started to be accepted more quickly, as if his grandmother had lost the ability to say no with the same authority she had always had. He knew she didn't want to disappoint him, that with her loneliness she wanted to please him, keep the twins around, and that became clear to Caden. Perhaps without realizing the depth of his actions, he began testing the limits more deeply. He would even innocently ask if he could go out without notice, or if he could bring friends over. And, as if it were impossible to say no, Viva, in her vulnerability, ended up giving in. Kieran, on the other hand, with his more reserved nature, seemed to be more strategic. He observed everything carefully, studying each reaction of his grandmother, noticing when she was more tired or distracted. It was as if he knew exactly when she would be more open to persuasion, more susceptible to his suggestions. He started making little comments, hinting that she wasn't being fair, that her children, the twins' parents, might not know how to treat them properly. With his almost enigmatic calmness, he knew exactly how to manipulate the situation, making Viva feel guilty, as if she were the only one responsible for their happiness. One day, while they were all sitting in the living room, Kieran said something that would stay in Viva's mind for a long time. He said, in a low voice but loaded with meaning, "You don't realize, Grandma, but when you say yes to everything, you're not doing us any good. You're making us drift further from reality." Those words hit Viva like an arrow. She, who had always tried so hard to be a good grandmother, a good person, was now confronted with the idea that maybe she was, in fact, failing. But what made her feel a knot in her stomach was the way Kieran looked at her at that moment. It wasn't a look of accusation, but of silent understanding, as if he was waiting for her to figure out for herself what was happening. He knew her weakness, and more than that, he knew how to use it. Caden, noticing Viva's reaction, intensified his behavior. He began to play with the idea of pushing the limits even further. One afternoon, when he came home later than agreed, he just smiled and said, "Oh, Grandma, it's not that bad, right? Why worry so much?" And contrary to what would have been expected, Viva didn't have the strength to complain. Instead, she felt guilty for questioning his behavior, for thinking she might be a strict, old-fashioned grandmother. As the weeks went by, the situation became increasingly complicated. The twins, realizing they could manipulate situations to their advantage, began to cross even further boundaries of morality and ethics. During dinners, Caden, with his undeniable charm, started asking for things that would have been unthinkable before, like spending his grandmother's money on gifts for themselves or their friends. Kieran, with his soft words, would make suggestions that they could go out without notice because, after all, everyone was busy and wouldn't notice. And Viva, despite her efforts to stay firm, found herself caught in a cycle of guilt and confusion. She felt more and more guilty for not being able to set the boundaries she once imposed so easily. She was losing control, and that terrified her. She knew that her sense of morality, the way she had been raised and educated, was being challenged. Yet her feelings of loneliness, her need for affection, and to be accepted by her grandchildren made her question whether it was worth going against her own beliefs and giving in to their manipulations. The twins, in turn, became increasingly confident that they could manipulate the situation. They didn't do it aggressively, but with a subtle, refined skill that made it impossible for Viva to clearly see when they were crossing the line. Every small victory, every yes, she said, fed their need to push the boundaries even further. It was a silent dance of manipulation where they knew her weaknesses and used them with surgical precision, while Viva unsuccessfully tried to maintain her composure. Meanwhile, as this unfolded, Viva, alone in her house, found herself consumed by doubt. It was as if she were being pulled into a place she didn't know, where the principles that had guided her throughout her life seemed to be disappearing, slowly being replaced by a desperate need for affection, for belonging, and above all, for love. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how to escape this emotional whirlwind that seemed to be swallowing her. Caden and Kieran's manipulation was not obvious, but it was effective. They had learned to use their grandmother's weaknesses as a silent weapon, making her constantly question what was happening to her and their relationship. And, as the weeks passed, Viva's vulnerability became more and more evident. When Alicia finally returned from her trip, after weeks of being busy with her diplomatic mission, she expected to find her mother, Viva, as always, welcoming and with the house organized. But when she arrived, she was greeted by an odd atmosphere. The environment felt heavier than usual. Something was different, and her mother seemed more distant, more restless, as if carrying an invisible burden. Alicia tried to ignore the feeling, but soon the small changes began to reveal themselves in details that couldn't be ignored. As Alicia spoke with Viva, she noticed something that left her uneasy. The way her mother spoke about the twins, Caden and Kieran, was strange. There was a mix of confusion and guilt in her words. She talked about how the boys had changed, how they were growing and becoming more challenging, but she also mentioned, with a quiet pain, that maybe she herself hadn't done everything right. Alicia, as a mother, knew that something was out of place. She knew the relationship Viva had with her children, and that the grandmother had always had a loving and firm relationship with her grandchildren. But now, when trying to talk about it with Viva, something didn't fit. The grandmother seemed hesitant, almost guilty, as if she was hiding something. Then something unexpected happened. Alicia began to notice exchanged glances between the twins and her mother, glances that were not typical of a grandmother-grandson relationship. Caden, the more confident of the two, had always been very open, but now he seemed to avoid Alicia, steering clear of direct eye contact. Kieran, more introspective, appeared more distant, as if he were in his own world. But there was something in their behavior, something in their words, that didn't align with the image Alicia had of her children. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. In a moment of conversation, Alicia, trying to understand what was happening, pulled the twins aside for a deeper discussion. It was then that she finally discovered what had been going on during the week she had been away. The boys had started to subtly manipulate their grandmother, almost imperceptibly. There was a thin line between normal grandparent-grandchild interactions and what she now knew to be emotional manipulation. They were exploiting Viva's vulnerability, taking advantage of her loneliness and desire to please them. Caden, with his charm, had begun testing Viva's limits, asking for things that would normally be denied, and she, too weak to say no, gave in. Kieran, with his soft and insinuating words, manipulated their grandmother's emotions, making her feel guilty and doubt her own decisions. They had created an invisible web of manipulation, which Alicia now saw clearly. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. Alicia couldn't understand how this had happened without her noticing. How had her children, whom she had always considered decent and well-intentioned people, gotten involved in such a destructive dynamic with her mother? Anger began to rise within Alicia, but at the same time, a deep sense of disappointment took over her. How could she have let this happen? How could she have trusted them so much without seeing the signs? Alicia's explosion of anger was inevitable. She confronted the twins, asking, her eyes filled with frustration and pain, how they could do something so cruel to such a good woman, a woman who had given them her unconditional love for so long. Their response was cold and evasive. They tried to justify themselves, but the truth was that deep down they knew they had crossed a line, and now they were trying to distance themselves from the responsibility of their actions. But the biggest outburst from Alicia came when she turned to her mother. She felt betrayed, not by Viva, but by the way her children had treated their grandmother. How could someone who had always been so strong, so firm, have been led into this emotional manipulation without even realizing it? Alicia couldn't process the idea that her mother, a woman who had always known right from wrong, was so immersed in this emotional whirlwind. She shouted at Viva, not out of anger, but from deep pain. "Mum, how could you let this happen? How could you allow them to do this to you?" The words came out of her mouth as a release of frustration, a mixture of sadness and anger that she didn't even realize she had been holding in. She felt that, by protecting her children, Viva had lost herself in an emotional maze that was now swallowing the entire family. Viva, with tear-filled eyes, tried to explain, but the words didn't come out right. She never wanted the twins to act this way, never imagined that her desire to be a caring and understanding grandmother could lead her to this point. She didn't know how to stop it, how to push the boys away from their manipulations, because deep down, she still saw them as the children they once were. The pain was deep, not only from the betrayal of her grandchildren, but from the realization that she herself had failed to protect herself, to maintain her dignity. Alicia, with tear-filled eyes, tried to understand her mother's pain, but her anger was stronger. She wanted to protect Viva, but she also wanted to protect herself, not letting herself be swept away by this emotional spiral that was now taking over everyone. She didn't know how to resolve the situation, but she knew she had to do something. The atmosphere in the house was heavy with tension. What had once been a warm home, filled with laughter and cheerful conversations, now felt like an emotional prison where the walls seemed to be slowly closing in. The relationship between mother and daughter was in ruins, and the trust among everyone involved had shattered. The worst part was that no one knew how to rebuild it. Alicia found herself facing a dilemma. Should she protect her mother at all costs, or should she also face the truth about her children? And most importantly, what could she do to heal the wounds that were now open, wounds that she feared might never fully heal? On a quiet afternoon, Viva's house was wrapped in palpable tension. The last few days had been difficult, filled with arguments and the lingering feelings of hurt that hung in the air. Viva, a woman with a huge heart and a soul full of love, was going through one of the most painful moments of her life. Her daughter, Lara, had decided to leave. The distance between them seemed like an impossible mountain to climb, and it tormented her deeply. Lara, young with grand dreams and an untamable desire to follow her own path, believed she needed to be far away, away from everything that held her, even from her mother. But Viva couldn't understand. For her, the idea of losing her daughter, of seeing the house empty, without the laughter, without the hurried footsteps in the hall, was unbearable. She loved Lara more than anything in the world, and the thought of watching her daughter leave felt like the last page of a book too sad to be written. That day, Lara's words had been harsh, but also filled with silent suffering. She said she needed space, that she needed to go off on her own, searching for something she didn't yet know, but something she could no longer find in the house where they had grown up. Lara's voice was firm, but her eyes were tear-filled, as though carrying a weight too hard to explain. Viva couldn't accept it. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't let it happen. Without thinking, without considering the consequences of her own feelings, she rushed downstairs. Her heart was pounding, a whirlwind of emotions that didn't let her think clearly. The sound of her own footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, ringing loudly in her ears. She just wanted to reach her daughter, stop her from leaving, ask her once again not to go. However, as she hurried down the stairs, cruel fate took over. Viva's foot slipped on a step that had worn down a bit, and in an instant, she lost her balance. Her body was thrown forward with an unexpected force. She tried to hold on, but it was too late. The sound of her body hitting the floor was sharp, cruel, and suddenly, everything went silent. Lara, who had been by the door, heard the sound of the fall and ran toward her mother. Her body trembled as she took in the scene before her eyes. She didn't know what to do, nor how to handle it. Fear took over her being, and she screamed Viva's name, but there was no response. She knelt beside her mother, who lay still, and saw her eyes closed, lifeless, without the spark that had always been there. Desperation overwhelmed Lara in a crushing wave. One moment, she was about to leave to pursue her own life, and the next, everything seemed to have crumbled around her. Viva, with her soul full of love, had tried to do something impossible, prevent the departure of the daughter she loved so much. She had acted on a deep instinct, a desperate attempt to hold on to the only person she had left. But in her attempt to keep her, her life was extinguished in a way that was as tragic as it was sudden. Lara, crying uncontrollably, felt a pain so deep it seemed to tear at her soul. She had never imagined that her decision to leave would take her mother's life, and the weight of it crushed her. In that moment, she realized just how deep and unconditional Viva's love had been, and how selfish she had been, thinking she could leave without looking back. The tragedy unfolded before her eyes, and the house, once filled with hope and dreams, became a place of mourning and longing. The emptiness left after Viva's loss was something Lara would never be able to fill. And deep in her heart, she knew that her mother's departure had been Viva's final act of love, a love Lara hadn't understood until the moment of the loss. The fall that ended Viva's life became an indelible mark in Lara's life, a grim reminder that sometimes the choices made with the heart can lead to irreversible consequences. And as Lara, in tears, reflected on what she had lost, she promised that from that moment on, she would learn to live differently, more consciously, and more grateful for the chance to have been loved by someone so special. After Viva's death, the house where she had lived for so many years with her daughter fell into deep silence. The sound of laughter and conversation that once filled every corner of the home had been replaced by a cold emptiness, an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill again. The authorities arrived quickly at the scene of the accident, assessed the situation, and after an investigation concluded that the fall had been a tragic accident. There was no evidence of foul play, nothing suggesting that anyone had acted with ill intentions. The official explanation was simple. Viva, in a moment of desperation, lost her balance while rushing down the stairs, trying to prevent her daughter from leaving. The fall was fatal, and with it went the life of a woman who, deep down, only wanted to make her daughter understand how much she loved her. However, for the family, things were not so simple. For Lara especially, the words of the authorities seemed empty in the face of the pain she carried. She felt as if there was something she could have done to prevent that fate. The farewell words exchanged with her mother still echoed in her mind. How could she have let the situation get to this point? How could she have left, leaving her mother so desperate? Every step she took to move forward seemed to lead her deeper into the well of guilt. She knew that Viva's love was immense and unconditional, but at that moment it seemed as though her mother's love had somehow been the cause of the tragedy. The weight of guilt spread through the family like a shadow. Each of its members, even those who were distant, had to deal with the impact of such a sudden and devastating loss. What could have been done to prevent the tragedy? Was there something they could have said or done to ease Viva's pain, to keep her from feeling so desperate? These thoughts lingered in everyone's mind, without rest. They were marked by a pain that could not be healed with words. Lara especially felt overwhelmed by a sense of failure. She knew that the decision to leave home had been hers, but she never imagined it would lead to something so irreversible. She didn't know how to deal with the fact that by following her own path, her mother lost her life. She thought about all the unsaid words, all the acts of affection that could have been shown before that last bitter conversation. If only she had stayed a little longer, if only she had realized how devastated her mother was by her departure, maybe things would have been different. But now, there was no going back. The house where Viva had lived now felt like a prison for Lara. Every object, every memory seemed to accuse her of something she didn't know how to fix. At night, when silence filled the house, Lara felt the weight of her mother's presence, as if she were there, just waiting for her daughter to understand what had happened. But Lara couldn't understand. All she could do was sink deeper into guilt, believing she had failed in her role as a daughter, as someone who should have provided support, care, and unconditional love to her mother. Other family members tried to comfort Lara, but no one seemed capable of easing the pain she carried. They too felt the weight of guilt, though in different ways. Some wondered if they could have intervened, if they could have seen the signs of Viva's suffering before it was too late. Others blamed themselves for not having supported Lara enough, for not realizing how distant she had become, how conflicted she was with her mother. The questions and doubts never ceased. Each one of them, in some way, believed they could have done something differently. As time passed, Lara distanced herself from the house where she had grown up, trying to find some peace, but the pain followed her like an unwanted shadow. She sought therapy, friends, and on some nights even the silence of nature, hoping that somehow the pain might ease. But as time went on, she understood that guilt would never fully disappear. She would have to learn to live with it, with the loss, with the pain of Viva's death, and with the regret that would accompany her every step of her life. And so, despite the authorities providing an official explanation, the real pain for the family was somewhere else. It wasn't in the conclusions that could be read in a police report. The real pain was in the soul, in the heavy heart of those left behind, trying to find some kind of comfort, but knowing deep down that the tragedy couldn't be undone. They carried the marks of guilt and trauma, and these marks would become part of their lives forever. The weight of Viva's death would not be something they could simply forget or overcome. Instead, they would have to learn to live with this pain, always trying to find a path to healing, even when the loss seemed impossible to overcome. Alicia never imagined her life would take such a dramatic turn. She had always been a calm person with simple dreams and a heart full of good intentions. But when the twins entered her life, everything changed. At first, she felt an immediate connection with them. The children, despite their young age, had an infectious energy and a gaze so deep it seemed they had already lived many lives. Alicia felt blessed to be there, to be part of the lives of two such special people. However, the relationship between them, which seemed to be built on bonds of affection and understanding, quickly became something unexpected, painful, and irreparable. The story began to unravel when Alicia's intentions became entangled with those of her children in a confusing and tragic way. She could no longer distinguish between what was right and what was wrong. The tension between her and the twins grew gradually, until, in a moment of emotional weakness, Alicia did something she could never have imagined doing. In an impulse, something that didn't even make sense to her, she let herself be led by a spontaneous decision, something that could no longer be undone. What seemed like a small, inconsequential gesture turned into a tragedy that would shake the entire family forever. When the truth came to light, there were no words strong enough to describe what followed. The pain spread like a storm, destroying everything in its path. The twins, who had once seen Alicia as a mother figure, someone they could trust, could not understand what had happened. Alicia's actions left them not just confused, but devastated. They felt betrayed by the person who had become so important in their lives. The children were emotionally shattered, their fragile souls marked by deep suffering. Alicia's family, which had always been close-knit and united, also suffered immensely from the situation. Each member carried their own burden of pain, and the words that had once been spoken with affection now were filled with accusation and disapproval. Alicia's parents, who had always believed in their daughter's goodness, now found themselves unable to understand what had led her to commit such a thoughtless act. They loved her, but the pain of watching the family disintegrate before their eyes made them question everything. How could this have happened? How could Alicia, who had always been so loving and kind, have caused so much pain? Alicia's siblings, who had always stood by her, were also broken. The trust that had been built over the years was now shattered. There was no ignoring the gravity of the situation. No one could understand why she had done what she did. Forgiveness seemed impossible, and the words that had once been exchanged with care and affection now sounded empty and filled with anger. What hurt the most, however, was the emptiness between Alicia and the twins. They were hurt in a way that no one could heal. What had happened between them didn't have a simple explanation. It wasn't something that could be justified with words or apologies. They were irreparably broken, and at the same time, Alicia felt a guilt that consumed her from within. She knew she could never undo it. The act of emotional betrayal had destroyed the trust the twins had in her, and with that, any chance of reconciliation seemed to have vanished. Alicia spent sleepless nights trying to understand what had happened. She tried to convince herself that it was just a mistake, a situation that could be fixed, but reality was relentless. Each attempt to fix what she had done only seemed to deepen the wound. She felt the weight of regret in every gesture, in every unspoken word. But deep down, she knew that nothing she did could return the trust the twins had lost. She had gone too far, and now it was too late. As the twins grew further apart, building an invisible wall between themselves and Alicia, the family members tried to find a way to cope with the suffering they were all living through. What had once been a strong and healthy bond had now turned into an emotional battlefield where forgiveness seemed like a concept too distant to reach. Each person, in their pain, felt trapped by a truth they could not change, by a mistake they could not forget. The relationships were torn apart, and the hope for healing seemed a distant dream. In those difficult days, Alicia found herself lost, trying to find a path to reconciliation, but not knowing where to begin. She knew her guilt was immense, and that what she had done could never be erased. But when she looked at the twins, she felt a deep pain and a desperate desire to change the past. However, time couldn't be reversed, and her words of regret seemed empty in the face of the suffering everyone was enduring. Alicia and the twins' story became a tale of lost love, destroyed trust, and a bond that, no matter how strong, couldn't withstand the weight of wrong choices. The pain that everyone carried in their hearts was immeasurable, and the scars left by the tragedy would be eternal. What could have been a story of healing and reconciliation had in reality become a tragedy of separated souls and broken hearts, unable to find forgiveness. The story of the Evans family is not just about love or pain, but about the limits of forgiveness and the intricate layers of family relationships, a narrative that reveals how something seemingly irreversible can devastate hearts, turn bonds of trust into indelible marks, and create scars that can never be erased. The Evans family, once so united, now found themselves divided, with the echoes of the tragedy reverberating throughout the house. The memories of betrayal were so present that even in moments of silence, they seemed to scream, reminding everyone of what had happened and what could never be forgotten. The pain was palpable, a dense and heavy cloud hanging over each family member, like a shadow that never dissipated. Questions about forgiveness began to arise almost immediately after the fateful event. Could trust ever be restored after something so devastating? How much can love withstand such a huge mistake? These were the dilemmas each family member faced, with no easy or quick answers. How could they move forward when the weight of betrayal seemed to have infiltrated each of their hearts? And more importantly, who could forgive something so deep and irreparable? Alicia, who had once been a central figure of affection and support for the twins, now found herself in a sea of guilt and remorse. She desperately tried to find a way to redeem herself, to fix what had been destroyed, but every attempt seemed more futile. Every word she spoke, every gesture of kindness she tried to offer seemed to be in vain. The pain in the twins' eyes was clear. They were lost, confused, and above all, deeply hurt. The bond that had existed between them was irreparably broken. Alicia knew this. She felt it, and it hurt more than anything else. She had never imagined that a single act, a single mistake, could change everything. But what had once seemed like an isolated mistake had turned into an emotional rupture, leaving everyone around her shattered. The words of forgiveness, which she had tried to say so many times, seemed as empty as the echo of a closed door. There was no going back. She knew that on some level, the pain she had caused would be something she would have to carry with her forever. But what about the twins? They, who had once seen Alicia as a mother figure, now found themselves forced to face the reality of an emotional betrayal they could not understand. The pain they felt did not just stem from the act itself, but from the loss of trust in someone who was supposed to protect and love them. How could they move forward knowing that the person they had trusted the most had hurt them in such a deep way? Their relationship with Alicia would never be the same. And perhaps, they thought, neither would they ever be the same. The rest of the Evans family, who had gathered over the years around a shared love, was also torn apart. Alicia's father, who had always considered her an exemplary daughter, didn't know how to cope with what had happened. He searched for answers that seemed more and more distant. How could he have failed to notice what was going on? How could such a beloved and respected woman in the family have made such a mistake? The pain he felt was multiplied by a sense of helplessness. He wanted to help. He wanted to do something, but he didn't know what. Everything seemed lost. Alicia's mother, on the other hand, was equally devastated. She cried for her daughter, but also felt immense anger for everything that had happened. She couldn't help but wonder, did Alicia at any point truly regret what she had done? Or was this a mistake she would have to carry forever, with no chance of redemption? The nights were long and silent, filled with restless thoughts and broken hearts. Alicia's mother wished she could turn back time, change something, maybe a single word, a single gesture that could have prevented that immense pain. But time wouldn't go back. The tragedy had already unfolded. And in the midst of all this, there was silence. The silence of the Evans house, once filled with laughter and lively conversations, now became a place of reflection, of pain, and above all, of mourning. Mourning for what could have been, for relationships that were lost, and for broken souls now wandering in search of healing. But healing, as everyone would soon realize, was a much more complex concept than they had imagined. The story of the Evans family raises a fundamental question about the nature of human relationships. How far can we go in search of forgiveness? What happens when that limit is crossed and the wounds become irreparable? Can love survive such deep betrayal, or are the scars permanent and insurmountable? Over time, the family members learned that the answer to these questions was not simple. They found themselves in a minefield of contradictory emotions: the desire to forgive, the need to understand, and the difficulty of moving forward. As time passed, the scars of the tragedy became a permanent part of the Evans family's history, reminding everyone how the strongest bonds can be broken in the blink of an eye, and how forgiveness can be a silent battle, not always won. The moments of joy and unity, once so frequent, became increasingly rare. Pain had consumed everything, making any attempt at reconciliation a battle against something bigger than any of them could comprehend. The betrayal that had occurred would never be forgotten, and even as time passed, the marks of what happened would be etched in everyone's memories. This story, though tragic, is also a powerful reminder that families, as much as they love each other, are complex, and the limits of forgiveness are often harder to reach than we would like to admit. The scars that the Evans family carries are deep, and like all scars, they will never completely disappear. And that is what makes their story so moving and universal, a reflection of what happens when love is tested and the consequences are irreversible.